Some nightmares follow you no matter how far you run. Sometimes the person you once loved becomes the person you fear most. Dianne thought she was safe. 8 months pregnant in a quiet town, living under a new name, she believed her past couldn't reach her. Then she heard those familiar footsteps outside her door. When Sergeant Noel found her trembling in the bedroom closet, clutching her phone after whispering, "He found me," to the 911 dispatcher, he saw something that stopped him cold. The same terror he witnessed years ago in another woman's eyes. A case that ended his marriage and changed everything he thought he knew about protecting people. Her abusive ex had tracked her down, and now they're both trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse. What the officer does next will shock everyone and test them both in ways they never imagined. Can his unconventional decision break a cycle that has trapped Dianne for years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook, a town where the biggest excitement was usually the monthly farmers' market. Dianne Miller, though that wasn't the name she was born with, had awakened to the familiar weight of her 8-month belly and the gentle kicks of the life growing inside her. She'd chosen this place carefully 2 years ago, drawn to its tree-lined streets and the way neighbors still waved from their porches. It was the kind of town where people minded their own business, but still cared enough to check on you during a storm. At 38, Dianne had learned to appreciate quiet mornings. She moved slowly around her small apartment above the bakery, one hand supporting her back as she prepared her usual breakfast of oatmeal and chamomile tea. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Patterson tending to her roses across the street, and Mr. Chen opening his hardware store for the day. These simple rituals had become her anchor, proof that normal life was possible. The apartment itself was modest but warm. She'd furnished it carefully over the past 2 years, each piece chosen with intention. The blue armchair by the window where she read in the evenings, the small bookshelf filled with volumes about pregnancy and child development, the crib she'd assembled herself, painted white and positioned where morning light would fall across it. Everything spoke of hope, of a future she was building one careful day at a time. Her job at the Millbrook Public Library suited her perfectly. Quiet, predictable, filled with the kind of gentle conversations that never delved too deep. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, had hired her without too many questions when she'd arrived with her new identity documents carefully stored in a shoebox under her bed. A social security card, driver's license, and work history for Dianne Miller, all expertly crafted by someone who understood that sometimes people needed to disappear. The documents represented more than just false papers. They were her lifeline to freedom. She'd paid dearly for them, using money she'd saved secretly over years of marriage, hiding 20s and 10s in places Marcus would never think to look. Between the pages of books he'd never read, sewn into the lining of old coats, tucked inside tampon boxes. The careful accumulation of escape money had taken 3 years. Dianne Miller had no history of violence, no restraining orders, no trail of police reports. She was simply a quiet woman who'd moved to Millbrook to start fresh after a divorce. The library patrons knew her as helpful and kind, always ready with a book recommendation or a gentle smile. She'd built this life deliberately, like constructing a wall between her present and her past. But some mornings, when the light hit the mirror just right, she still saw Dianne Watson looking back at her. The 19-year-old girl who'd married Marcus because he was charming and confident and made her feel special, before she learned that his charm was a weapon and his confidence masked a need to control everything around him. The first time he'd hit her, she was 22. He'd cried afterward, promising it would never happen again, buying her flowers and jewelry as if gifts could erase the handprint on her face. She'd believed him then, the way young women often believe that love can fix damaged men. By 25, The apologies came less frequently. By 30, they'd stopped entirely. She'd lost babies before. 3 miscarriages that Marcus blamed on her stress, her weakness, her inability to do the one thing women were supposed to do right. Each loss had broken something inside her, but this pregnancy felt different, stronger, as if this child was determined to survive despite everything. 15 miles away, Sergeant Noel was starting his shift at the Millbrook Police Department, unaware that this Tuesday would reshape everything he thought he knew about second chances. At 43, Noel had been a cop for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of domestic violence from 100 yards away, long enough to know that the most dangerous moment for an abused woman was often when she tried to leave. His divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, another casualty of a job that demanded everything and gave little back except nightmares. And a pension plan. Lisa had been patient for 12 years, but the Sarah Chen case had broken something between them that couldn't be repaired. She'd watched him become obsessed with the domestic violence call that ended with a woman's death, and a man walking free on a technicality. She'd watched him blame himself for not doing more, for following protocol instead of his instincts. "You can't save everyone, Joel," Lisa had said the night she'd moved out, "and you're killing yourself trying." But he couldn't explain to her that saving people was the only thing that made the job worthwhile. That every successful intervention, every life preserved, helped balance the scales against all the times he'd arrived too late. The Sarah Chen file still sat in his desk drawer, a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. A young mother, terrorized by an ex-husband who'd violated every restraining order the courts had issued. Noel had followed procedure, documented everything, made arrests when the law allowed, but restraining orders were just pieces of paper. And Marcus Chen had been smart enough to always have alibis, to always stop just short of what the prosecutors could prove in court. Sarah had called 911 17 times in 6 months. 17 times Noel or his colleagues had responded, taken statements, filed reports. The 18th call had come too late. A neighbor reporting screams and then sudden silence. They'd found Sarah's body in her kitchen, her 2-year-old daughter, hiding in a closet, clutching a stuffed elephant. Marcus Chen had been convicted eventually, but the victory felt hollow. Sarah was still dead, her daughter still orphaned, and Noel still woke up some nights wondering what he could have done differently. His marriage hadn't survived the weight of that wondering. Now, as he settled into his patrol car for another day, in a town where the worst crime was usually teenagers spray-painting the water tower, Noel carried both the weight of his past failures and a determination to never let protocol stand in the way of protecting someone who needed help. He had no way of knowing that in a few hours he'd face exactly that choice again. The radio crackled to life as he pulled out of the station parking lot. "All units, be advised we have reports of a suspicious person in the residential area near Maple Street." Caller reported someone walking around houses, looking in windows. Noel reached for his radio. "Unit 7 responding." It was 2:47 p.m. when everything changed. Dianne had just returned from her weekly prenatal appointment, Dr. Morrison's reassuring words still fresh in her mind. "Everything looks perfect. Baby's in good position, heartbeat strong. Another few weeks and you'll be holding your little one." She'd climbed the stairs to her apartment slowly, one hand on the railing, the other supporting her belly. The afternoon sun streamed through her kitchen window as she set her purse on the counter and reached for a glass of water. That's when she saw him. Marcus Watson stood at the edge of Mrs. Patterson's rose garden, his eyes fixed on her apartment. Window, 2 years of careful hiding, 2 years of believing she was safe, crumbled in an instant. He looked older, his dark hair now threaded with grey, but his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered. He wasn't looking around frantically or calling her name. He was simply standing there, waiting for her to see him. Their eyes met. Through the glass, and Marcus smiled. The glass slipped from Diane's hand, shattering on the kitchen floor. Water spread across the linoleum as she backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched him pull out his phone, saw his lips move as he spoke into it, his gaze never leaving her window. He'd found her. After 2 years of freedom, he'd found her. With trembling hands, she reached for her own phone and dialed the 3 numbers she'd hoped never to use again. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Dianne Miller, she whispered, backing toward her bedroom. I live at 247 Maple Street, apartment 2B. My ex-husband found me. He's outside and I'm scared. The 911 operator's voice was calm and professional. Mom, I need you to stay on the line. Are you in immediate danger? Is he trying to enter your residence? Dianne pressed herself against her bedroom wall. Phone clutched to her ear, trying to control her breathing. Through the apartment's thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking frantically in the yard below. He's just standing there, watching. But you don't understand. He's not supposed to know where I am. I changed my name. I moved here. To get away from him. I understand, ma'am. I'm dispatching officers to your location now. Is there a secure room where you can wait until they arrive? Diane's eyes swept her small bedroom. The door had a simple lock, nothing that would stop someone determined. But the closet. She could barricade herself in the closet. Yes, I can hide. Good. Stay on the line with me. What's your ex-husband's name? Marcus Watson. The name felt like poison on her tongue. He's 41, about 6'2", dark hair with grey. He's wearing a blue jacket. She peered through her bedroom window and saw him still standing in the same spot, now openly staring at her building. He's not hiding anymore. It's like he wants me to know he found me. As she spoke, Marcus began walking toward her building with purposeful strides. Not hurrying, not running, just walking like a man who had all the time in the world. Ma'am, I need you to get to that secure location now. Officers are 3 minutes out. Dianne grabbed a handful of clothes from her dresser and rushed into her walk-in closet, pulling the door shut behind her. In the cramped space, surrounded by maternity clothes and the few possessions she'd allowed herself to keep from her old life, she felt like a child hiding from monsters. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 38 years old, 8 months pregnant, she was hiding in a closet like the terrified young woman she'd been 16 years ago when Marcus first showed her what happened to wives who questioned his decisions. Officers are en route, the dispatcher assured her. Can you still see him from where you are? No, I'm in the closet now. Diane's voice was barely a whisper, but I can hear footsteps on the stairs. He's coming up. The building had 3 apartments, but Marcus's footsteps stopped directly outside her door. 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the apartment. Dianne, his voice was exactly as she remembered, controlled, patient, with an undertone that promised consequences for disobedience. I know you're in there. Open the door. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Even through 2 doors and 8 months of pregnancy, her body responded to that voice with familiar terror. Her pulse quickened, her palms began to sweat, and she felt the same shrinking sensation that had once made her believe she deserved whatever punishment he deemed necessary. We need to talk, Marcus continued, his voice conversational. You can't just disappear and think there won't be consequences. You're carrying my child. The possessiveness in his voice made her stomach churn. In his mind, she'd never stopped being his property. The baby had never been a person growing inside her body. It had always been another possession he'd been denied. Ma'am, are you still there? The dispatcher's voice brought her back to the present. He's at my door, Dianne breathed. He's talking to me. Don't respond. Help is almost there. But Marcus's voice carried through the apartment walls. I spent 2 years looking for you, Dianne. 2 years tracking down every lead, every rumor about where you might have gone. Do you know what that felt like? Having my wife just vanish? In the darkness of the closet, Dianne closed her eyes and remembered the night she'd left. 3 years of planning, 3 years of hiding money and documents, 3 years of pretending to be the obedient wife while secretly preparing for escape. She'd waited until he was passed out drunk, loaded her car with only essential items, and driven through the night to a women's shelter 3 states away. The shelter had connected her with people who specialized in helping women disappear. New identity, new social security number, new life. It had cost her everything she'd saved and more, but it had bought her 2 years of peace. 2 years of believing she was free. "I found your friend Janet," Marcus said, and Dianne's blood turned to ice. Janet had been her only confidant during the marriage, the one person who'd known about the abuse. She was very helpful. Once we had a proper conversation about loyalty, the threat was clear. Marcus didn't make idle statements. If he said he'd had a conversation with Janet, it meant Janet had been hurt. It meant her friend had paid the price. "For Dianne's escape, ma'am. I can hear sirens. Officers will be there in under a minute." Dianne could hear them too, faint but growing closer. Marcus's voice changed, becoming more urgent. "You hear that, Dianne? You called the police on your own husband. Again, you know how this ends. They'll take statements, maybe arrest me for a few hours, and then I'll be right back. You can't hide from me anymore." The doorknob rattled as he tested it. Then came the sound of something scraping against metal. He was trying to pick the lock or force it, or, "Ma'am, officers are entering your building now." Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, different from Marcus's measured pace. These were the sounds of urgency, of authority responding to a call for help. "Police, step away from the door." Sergeant Noel's voice carried through the building with the kind of command presence that came from 15 years of dealing with volatile situations. But Marcus's response was calm, almost amused. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to talk to my wife." "Sir, step away from the door and keep your hands visible." "She's pregnant with my child. Surely you understand." A man's need to protect his family. Even through the closet door, Dianne could hear the manipulation in Marcus's voice. The reasonable tone, the appeal to traditional values, the suggestion that he was the reasonable party in this situation. It was the same voice he'd used with police officers, judges, and social workers for years. "Sir, I need you to step back now." There was movement in the hallway, shuffling sounds. Then Marcus's voice again, farther away but still carrying. "I'm not resisting, officer. I'm simply trying to reconnect with my wife after a difficult separation. Is that a crime?" "Ma'am?" Noel's voice was closer now, speaking through her apartment door. "This is Sergeant Noel with Millbrook Police. Are you safe? Can you open the door?" Dianne's legs trembled as she stood, her pregnant belly making movement awkward in the confined space. She opened the closet door slowly, then crossed her bedroom to peer out the window. Marcus was in handcuffs, but he was talking animatedly to a younger officer, probably explaining how this was all a misunderstanding. "I'm here," she called through the door. "I'm safe. I'm coming to the door." As she turned the deadbolt and slowly opened the door, she saw Sergeant Noel for the first time. He was shorter than Marcus, but solidly built, with graying temples and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. More importantly, those eyes held none of the skepticism she'd grown accustomed to seeing from police officers over the years. "Are you hurt?" he asked immediately. "No, I'm not hurt, but he found me. I don't know how, but he found me." Noel's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I need you to know that we take domestic violence very seriously here, but I also need to understand the situation. You said this is your ex-husband?" "Yes. Marcus Watson. We've been divorced for 2 years, but he's been looking for me. I changed my name, moved here to start over." Her voice broke slightly. "I thought I was safe." "You are safe," Noel said firmly. "But I need to ask, is there an active restraining order?" Dianne's heart sank. This was always the question that complicated everything. "No, the old ones expired, and I couldn't get new ones without revealing my location. My lawyer said it was safer to just disappear." Noel nodded slowly, and she could see him processing the information. Without active legal documentation, his options for keeping Marcus away were limited, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't planning to follow standard protocol. "Ma'am, I need you to pack a bag. You can't stay here tonight. Where will I go? I don't have family. I don't have money for a hotel. We'll figure that out. But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." He glanced toward the stairs where Marcus was being processed by the other officer. "Tell me about your history with this man." Dianne sat on her couch, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, trying to find words for 16 years of systematic destruction. Sergeant Noel sat across from her, notebook open but pen resting, giving her the kind of patient attention she'd rarely experienced from law enforcement. "Start wherever feels comfortable," he said gently. "I need to understand the pattern so I know how to help you." Through the window, she could see Marcus being questioned by Officer Bradley, a young man who looked barely old enough to vote, let alone handle a complex domestic situation. Marcus was animated, but controlled, using hand gestures and earnest expressions that she recognized as his performance mode. "I was 19 when we married," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was 25, confident, successful. I thought I was lucky that someone like him wanted someone like me. What was someone like you?" The question caught her off guard. In all her years of telling this story to counselors, lawyers, and social workers, no one had ever asked her to define herself rather than just catalogue the abuse. Quiet, uncertain. I'd grown up in foster care, aged out of the system at 18. I was working at a diner, living in a studio apartment above a laundromat. Marcus was a customer who started coming in regularly, always asked to sit in my section. She managed a bitter smile. "I thought it was romantic." What changed? Nothing changed. He was always controlling. I just didn't recognize it at first. He'd pick me up from work, which seemed sweet until I realized he was checking up on me. He'd buy me clothes, which felt generous, until I understood they were uniforms he expected me to wear. He'd plan all our dates, make all our decisions, handle all our money. Noel was writing now, but his eyes remained focused on her face. "When did it become physical?" "About 6 months after we married. I'd made dinner, but it was too salty. He threw the plate against the wall, grabbed my wrist, told me his mother had taught him that a wife who couldn't cook was a wife who didn't respect her husband." She touched her left wrist unconsciously. "He twisted it until I apologized." "Did you call police?" "No." "He cried afterward, said he'd had a bad day at work, bought me flowers. I believed it was an isolated incident." She looked out the window. Again, Marcus was now sitting in the back of Officer Bradley's patrol car, but she could see him talking, probably spinning some narrative about a misunderstood husband trying to reunite with his pregnant wife. "The physical abuse escalated over time?" Noel prompted. "Yes, but it was always calculated, never anywhere that would show if I wore long sleeves. Never hard enough to require hospitalization." Marcus was smart. He knew exactly how far he could go without creating evidence. Noel's jaw tightened. She'd seen that expression before on the faces of officers who understood the system's limitations, who knew that the worst abusers were often the most careful about staying just inside legal grey areas. "You mentioned miscarriages earlier." "Dianne's," and moved protectively to her belly. 3, the first was probably natural. I was only 22. These things happen. But the second one happened right after he'd shoved me down the stairs for getting mouthy with his boss's wife at a company party. The third, her voice broke. The third was after he punched me in the stomach because I'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. Did you seek medical attention? Yes, but I never told doctors the real cause. Marcus always drove me to the hospital, always stayed by my side, always had explanations ready. I fell downstairs. I slipped on ice. I walked into a door. She met Noel's eyes. You have to understand, by that point, I believed it was my fault. He convinced me that if I were a better wife, if I didn't make him angry, if I just tried harder, he wouldn't have to correct me. The radio on Noel's belt crackled. "Sergeant Noel, we need you to advise on the situation with the subject. He's requesting to speak with his wife." Noel keyed his radio. Negative. The victim is giving a statement. I'll be down shortly. But through the window, Dianne could see Marcus had gotten Officer Bradley's attention, was pointing up toward her. Apartment window. Even from this distance, she could read his body language, the earnest concern, the worried husband act he'd perfected over the years. He's good at this, she said quietly. He's had years to practice making himself look like the reasonable one. Tell me about how you finally left. It took 3 years to plan. I started hiding money whenever I could. A 20 here, a 10 there. I opened a bank account at a branch across town using my maiden name. I researched women's shelters, learned about victim advocacy programs, found out how to get new identity documents. Her voice grew stronger as she talked about her escape. I waited until he was passed out drunk after a company party. He'd hit me earlier that evening because I'd talked too long to his colleague's wife, said I was embarrassing him by being too friendly. Where did you go? Women's shelter in Ohio, then another one in Kentucky. They helped me connect with people who specialize in helping abuse victims disappear completely. New social security number, new driver's license, new work history. It cost me everything I'd saved and more, but it was worth it. How did he find you now? I don't know. The admission terrified her. I was so careful. I never used my real name, never contacted anyone from my old life, never posted anything online. I built Diana Miller from scratch. She has her own credit. History, employment records, everything. Noel was quiet for a moment, processing. Diane, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is this baby Marcus's? The question she'd been dreading. The complication that made everything more complex. I don't know, she whispered. The timing could work either way. I was with Marcus until about 2 years ago, but after I left, I met someone at the shelter in Kentucky. Another woman's brother. He was helping her move to a safe house. We spent one night together before I came here. Just one night, but the timing means either man could be the father. Yes, and I've been too scared to find out for sure. If it's Marcus's baby, he has rights. If it's not... She stopped, realizing the implications. If it's not, then his entire justification for tracking you down becomes even more about control and possession than biology. A knock at the door interrupted. Them, Officer Bradley's voice carried through. Sergeant, we need to talk. Noel stood, his expression grim. Stay here. Don't answer the door for anyone except me. As he stepped into the hallway, Dianne could hear muffled conversation. Officer Bradley's young voice, uncertain and deferential. Marcus's voice, too calm and too reasonable. And underlying it all, Noel's measured responses. She moved to the window and saw more patrol cars arriving. What had started as a simple domestic call was escalating into something bigger. Through the thin walls, she caught fragments of conversation. Says his wife has mental health issues. Claims she stole money from their joint accounts. Has documentation showing they're still legally married. Diane's blood turned cold. Whatever Marcus had told Officer Bradley, it was working. She could see it in the young officer's posture, the way he kept glancing up at her window with new suspicion. Marcus had done this before. In their old town, he'd convinced 3 different police departments that she was unstable, that her claims of abuse were delusions brought on by postpartum depression after her miscarriages. He'd shown them carefully crafted medical records, testimony from friends who'd only seen his charming public persona, financial records that seemed to support his claims. By the time she'd left, half the local police force believed Marcus Watson was a long-suffering husband dealing with a mentally ill wife who made false accusations. Now he was doing it again. The door opened and Noel returned, his expression troubled. Behind him, Officer Bradley looked uncertain, clutching a folder of papers. Ma'am, Bradley said hesitantly, your husband has provided documentation that raises some questions about your current legal status and mental health history. I think we need to... My mental health history? Dianne stood slowly, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. What kind of documentation? Noel held up a hand. "Bradley, wait outside. I'll handle this." "But Sergeant, if she's having delusional episodes, outside. Now." After the younger officer left, Noel turned back to Dianne. His expression was careful, professional, but she could see belief wavering in his eyes. Marcus's poison was already working. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "He claims you've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and have a history of making false accusations against him. He has what appears to be medical records documenting episodes of paranoid delusion following pregnancy losses." Dianne felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was how Marcus worked. Not with his fists, but with carefully constructed lies that sounded more plausible than the truth. "Those records are falsified," she said quietly. "He has a friend who works in medical records. But you're already starting to doubt me, aren't you?" Noel was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to figure out what's true." That's exactly what he wants. When you can't tell what's real anymore, it's easier to just choose the version that requires less paperwork. Outside, more sirens were approaching. The folder of papers Marcus had provided sat on Diane's coffee table like evidence in a trial she was already losing. Noel picked it up, studying the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to spot forgeries and half-truths. "Tell me about Sarah Chen," Dianne said quietly. Noel's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with sudden wariness. "How do you know that name?" "I can see it in your face, the way you're trying to decide whether to believe me or the paperwork. Someone else made you doubt yourself before, someone else who had documentation and reasonable explanations." She sat back down slowly, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was starting to kick restlessly. "What happened to her?" For a long moment, Noel didn't answer. Outside, she could hear Marcus's voice, still calm and reasonable, talking to the growing number of officers. He was performing for an audience now, and Marcus had always been an excellent performer. "Sarah Chen called us 17 times in 6 months, Noel finally said. "Her ex-husband Marcus Chen, different Marcus, no relation to your Marcus, was stalking her, threatening her, violating restraining orders. Every time we responded, he had alibis. Every time we tried to arrest him, his lawyer would have him out within hours." "He sounds familiar." Marcus Chen convinced half the department that Sarah was mentally unstable. He had medical records showing she'd been treated for anxiety and depression after their divorce. He had witnesses who said she was obsessed with him, that she was making false accusations to get attention. Noel's voice grew tight. "I started to doubt her, too." "What happened?" "He killed her, beat her to death in her kitchen while her 2-year-old daughter hid in a closet. We found the little girl 12 hours later, still clutching a stuffed elephant, too traumatized to speak. The weight of that failure hung in the air between them." Dianne could see how it had changed Noel, how it had shaped his approach to every domestic call since. But she could also see how Marcus's carefully planted seeds of doubt were taking root. "My Marcus learned from cases like that," she said. "He studied how other abusers got caught, how they made mistakes. He made sure never to leave evidence, never to be predictable, never to give authorities clear grounds for action. The medical records he provided looked legitimate. They would. Marcus has connections, friends in medical billing, courthouse, clerks who owe him favors, people who can create convincing documentation for the right price." She met his eyes. "But I can prove they're false." "How?" "Hidden in the lining of my winter coat, I have real medical records from Dr. Patricia Hernandez in Indiana. She was the only doctor I ever told the truth to about the abuse. After my second miscarriage, I broke down in her office and told her everything. She documented it all, the bruises I'd hidden, the injuries I'd explained away, the pattern of trauma that caused my pregnancy losses." Noel looked up from Marcus's papers. "Where's this coat?" "In my bedroom closet, back corner inside a garment bag." As Noel went to retrieve the coat, Dianne heard footsteps on the stairs again. Multiple sets this time. Through her window, she could see that Marcus was no longer in the patrol car. He was standing with 3 officers, pointing up at her apartment. his expression one of concerned husband, mixed with righteous indignation. He'd convinced them. She could see it in their body language, the way they listened to him with sympathy rather than suspicion. By now, he'd probably told them about her history of false accusations, her alleged mental health issues, maybe even suggested that her pregnancy had triggered another psychotic episode. Noel returned with her coat, feeling along the lining until he found the hidden pocket she'd sewn there 2 years ago. Inside was a manila envelope containing documents she'd hoped never to need again. "Dr. Hernandez's records," she said as he opened the envelope. "Look at the dates, the documented injuries, the pattern of escalation, then compare them to what Marcus provided." Noel spread both sets of documents on her coffee table. Even to her untrained eye, the differences were obvious. Dr. Hernandez's notes were handwritten, informal, with medical terminology and timing that aligned with the abuse cycle Dianne had described. Marcus's documents were typed, formal, and painted a picture of a delusional woman making increasingly elaborate accusations against a patient husband. "The psychiatric evaluation he provided is dated 6 months after I left him," Dianne pointed out. "How could I have been evaluated by a doctor in Michigan when I was living in a shelter in Ohio?" "Easy to fake dates on computer-generated documents," Noel murmured, but his tone suggested he was beginning to see the inconsistencies. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Bradley's voice was more authoritative now. "Sergeant Noel, we need you downstairs. Detective Morrison wants to speak with both parties." Diane's heart sank. Detective Morrison. She'd dealt with detectives before, men in suits who made decisions based on paperwork rather than instinct, who found it easier to believe in mental illness than in the kind of systematic abuse that required them to do real work. "I need to go down there," Noel said, "but I want you to call someone." "I don't have anyone to call. Dr. Hernandez. Call her now while I'm dealing with this situation downstairs. Get her to fax verification of these records to our department. It's been 2 years. What if she doesn't remember me?" "Women like you aren't easily forgotten," Noel said firmly. "Make the call." As his footsteps receded down the stairs, Dianne was left alone with her phone and the growing certainty that Marcus was winning again. Through her window, she could see him talking animatedly to Detective Morrison, a heavy-set man with grey hair who nodded sympathetically as Marcus spoke. She found Dr. Hernandez's number in her old contacts, a remnant from her previous life that she'd been afraid to delete completely. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "Dr. Hernandez's office, this is Maria." "Maria, this is Dianne Watson. I was Dr. Hernandez's patient about 2 years ago. I need to speak with her urgently. It's an emergency." "Dianne! Oh, honey, we wondered what happened to you. You just disappeared." "After that last appointment." "Hold on, let me get the doctor." 30 seconds that felt like hours passed before Dr. Hernandez's warm voice came on the line. "Dianne, where are you? Are you safe?" "Dr. Hernandez, I need your help. Marcus found me. He's with police right now, showing them fake medical records that make me look mentally ill. I need you to verify the real records you kept about my abuse." "Of course, sweetheart. What do you need me to do?" "Fax everything to the Millbrook Police Department. Officer Noel, Sergeant Noel, needs verification that the abuse was real, that I wasn't delusional." "Already pulling your file." "Dianne, are you somewhere safe?" "I don't know anymore. He's very convincing, and the police are starting to believe him." "Honey, I've been treating domestic violence victims for 20 years. I documented everything from our sessions because I knew someday you might need proof. I'm sending everything now. Photos of injuries you showed me, my notes about the pattern of abuse, documentation of how your miscarriages correlated with escalations in violence." Through her window, Dianne could see the group of officers breaking up. Detective Morrison was shaking Marcus's hand while Noel stood apart, his expression unreadable. Officer Bradley was heading back toward her building. "Dr. Hernandez, what if they still don't believe me? Then you keep fighting, sweetheart. You've come too far to give up now. And Dianne, that baby you're carrying deserves a mother who's free from violence." Don't let him take that away from either of you." The line went dead just as Officer Bradley knocked on her door again. "Ma'am, Detective Morrison needs to speak with you downstairs." Dianne took a deep breath, gathered Dr. Hernandez's records, and prepared to face Marcus again for the first time in 2 years. Through her window, she could see him waiting by the police cars, his expression one of patient concern mixed with righteous vindication. He looked exactly like the man she'd fallen in love with 16 years ago. That was the most terrifying thing of all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot behind Diane's building as she descended the stairs, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation she'd spent 2 years trying to avoid. Detective Morrison stood near his unmarked sedan, a thick folder tucked under his arm, while Marcus waited nearby with the patient expression of a man confident in his eventual victory. When Marcus saw her, his face transformed into a mask of concerned relief that she recognized from countless previous performances. To anyone watching, he looked like a devoted husband reunited with his troubled wife. "Dianne," he said, taking a step toward her before Detective Morrison held up a restraining hand. "Thank God you're safe. When I couldn't find you, when you just disappeared, I was so worried about you and the baby." The familiarity of his voice, the way he said her name with just the right mix of love and concern, made her stomach clench with remembered fear. This was Marcus at his most dangerous, not when he was angry, but when he was performing. "Mrs. Watson," Detective Morrison began, and Dianne flinched at the name. "I'm Detective Morrison. I understand there's been some confusion about your situation here." "It's Miller," she said quietly. "Diana Miller. I legally changed my name." "Actually, ma'am, that's part of what we need to discuss. Your husband has provided documentation suggesting that the name change might not have been properly executed, and there are some concerns about your mental state when those decisions were made." Sergeant Noel emerged from the building behind her, holding a fax that was still warm from the machine. "Detective, I need to speak with you privately before we proceed." "In a moment, Sergeant. Mrs. Watson, your husband has explained that you've been struggling with some psychological issues since your pregnancy losses, and that you may have become convinced that he was responsible for those losses." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his expression pained but understanding. "Detective, I just want what's best for Dianne and our baby. She's been through so much trauma, and I'm worried that her current mental state might be putting both her and the child at risk." "I'm not mentally ill," Dianne said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I left him because he was abusive. I changed my name and moved here to escape him." "Dianne, sweetheart." Marcus's voice was gentle, heartbroken. "You know that's not true. You know the doctors said that sometimes trauma can create false memories, especially after losing babies, the way we did." The way he said "we" made her skin crawl, as if those losses had been shared grief instead of the result of his violence. Detective Morrison opened his folder. "Mrs. Watson, I have here documentation of several incidents where you made accusations against your husband that were later determined to be unfounded. Hospital records show no evidence of the injuries you claim to have sustained, and psychological evaluations suggest a pattern of delusional thinking." "Those records are falsified," Dianne said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded desperate. "Ma'am, these are official medical documents from respected institutions. Are you suggesting there's been some kind of conspiracy to fabricate your medical history?" Marcus shook his head sadly. "She's been paranoid like this before, Detective, always convinced that people are conspiring against her. The doctor said it was a coping mechanism, easier to believe in elaborate plots than to accept that sometimes bad things just happen." Noel stepped forward, the fax in his hand. "Detective, I need you to look at this. It's from Dr. Patricia Hernandez in Indiana. Verification of Mrs. Miller's real medical history." "Sergeant, we've already reviewed the relevant medical documentation." "No, sir, we've reviewed documents provided by the subject. This is independent verification from the victim's actual treating physician. Noel's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made Detective Morrison pause. Marcus's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that wasn't concern or love. It was calculation, the look of a chess player seeing an unexpected move. "Detective," Marcus said quickly, "I should mention that Dr. Hernandez was reported to the medical board for unprofessional conduct. Dianne became fixated on her during one of her episodes, and the doctor unfortunately enabled her delusions rather than providing proper treatment." But Noel was already handing the facts to Detective Morrison. "Sir, these are contemporaneous medical notes documenting patterns of physical abuse, including photographs of injuries and correlation between domestic violence incidents and pregnancy losses." As Detective Morrison read, his expression slowly changed. The sympathetic certainty was replaced by professional skepticism, and Marcus seemed to sense the shift in the room's dynamics. "Detective," Marcus said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "I think my wife may have manipulated this doctor as well. She can be very convincing when she's having an episode." "Mr. Watson," Detective Morrison said slowly, "these medical notes are very detailed. They include information about specific injuries that would be difficult to fabricate." "Dianne has always been creative," Marcus replied, but there was something different in his voice now. Less patient, more urgent. "She reads medical textbooks, researches symptoms online. She's very good at making false allegations sound credible." Dianne watched the interplay between the three men, feeling like a spectator at her own trial. This was the moment that always determined everything. Would authority figures believe the charming man with official documents, or the woman with a story that sounded too terrible to be true? "Mrs. Miller," Detective Morrison said, and the use of her chosen name felt like a small victory. "Can you explain how your husband located you if you've been living under an assumed identity?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I was so careful. I never used my real name, never contacted anyone from my old life, never left any kind of trail." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a note of embarrassed confession, "I hired a private investigator. When my wife disappeared, I was desperate to find her. I was worried about her mental state, especially when I learned she was pregnant. You hired someone to track me down." The violation felt like a physical blow. "Dianne, I was terrified that something had happened to you. You just vanished without a word. What was I supposed to think?" Detective Morrison was studying both sets of medical documents now, comparing dates and details. "Mr. Watson, these psychiatric evaluations you provided, they're dated after your wife had already left the state. How was she evaluated by a Michigan psychiatrist when she was living in Ohio?" For the first time, Marcus hesitated. It was barely a pause, just a fraction of a second, but Dianne saw it. So did Noel. The dates might be wrong on those copies," Marcus said. "Administrative errors happen in medical offices." "Actually, sir," Noel interjected, "I called the psychiatric office listed on these documents. They have no record of ever treating a patient named Dianne Watson." The mask was starting to slip. Marcus's expression grew tighter, more controlled. But underneath the facade, Dianne could see the anger building. This wasn't going according to his plan. "Detective," Marcus said, his voice becoming more forceful, "I'm concerned that my wife is being enabled in her delusions by law enforcement. She needs professional help, not validation of her paranoid fantasies. Mr. Watson, I'm going to need you to explain these inconsistencies in the documentation you provided." "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that I should call my attorney before answering any more questions." The admission hung in the air, like a confession. Innocent men dealing with their mentally ill wives didn't usually need lawyers. Detective Morrison closed his folder and looked at Dianne with new eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I think we need to have a longer conversation about your situation. And Mr. Watson, I think you should contact that attorney. But as the detective spoke, Dianne noticed something that made her blood run cold. While everyone's attention was focused on the document review, Marcus had positioned himself between her and the police cars. His body language had shifted from concerned husband to something more predatory, and in his right hand, partially concealed by his jacket, she could see the outline of something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Marcus had come prepared for more than just conversation. The moment Dianne recognized the shape concealed in Marcus's jacket, time seemed to slow. 16 years of marriage had taught her to read his body language like a survival manual, and every instinct screamed danger. His weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. His breathing had changed, and his eyes held the flat calculation she'd learned to fear more than his rage. He was deciding whether to run or fight. "Detective Morrison," she said quietly, trying not to let her voice shake. "I think Marcus has a weapon." The effect was immediate. Noel's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, while Detective Morrison took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed the situation. Officer Bradley, who had been standing near his patrol car, suddenly became very alert. "Mr. Watson," Detective Morrison said in the calm but authoritative tone police officers used when situations were about to escalate, "I need you to show me your hands." Marcus's expression shifted through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, then a return to wounded innocence. "Detective, I don't understand. Dianne is clearly having another paranoid episode. Sir, show me your hands. Now." For a moment, Marcus seemed to consider compliance. Then his facade cracked completely, revealing the cold rage that Dianne remembered. From their worst fights. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice losing all pretense of reasonableness. "I'm tired of playing games, tired of pretending that my own wife running away from me is somehow legal, tired of being treated like a criminal for trying to bring my family back together." "Marcus," Dianne said, instinctively moving closer to Noel, "please don't do this. Think about the baby." "That's all I've thought about for 2 years," he snapped. "My child, being raised by God knows who, learning to call some other man daddy while his real father is painted as a monster." "Sir, I need you to step back and show me your hands," Detective Morrison repeated, but Marcus was no longer listening to police commands. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have your wife just disappear? To wake up one morning and find everything gone, her clothes, her jewelry, our savings account emptied, no note, no explanation." His voice was rising, attracting attention from neighbors who were beginning to peer from their windows. "Marcus, I left because you hurt me," Dianne said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You hurt me for years, and I couldn't take it anymore." "I never hurt you!" The explosion of rage was so sudden that even the experienced officers took a step back. "I provided for you, I protected you, I loved you more than any woman deserved to be loved, and you repaid me by disappearing like a thief." In the night, this was the Marcus she remembered, the one who could rewrite history in real time, who genuinely believed his own version of events, where he was always the victim, and she was always ungrateful. "Mr. Watson," Noel said carefully, "we can work this out, but I need you to calm down and show us what you're carrying in your jacket." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to see what I'm carrying. You want to know what a man brings when he's been hunting his own wife for 2 years. His hand moved to his jacket, and every officer present tensed. But instead of a weapon, Marcus pulled out a thick manila envelope, worn from handling. "Pictures," he said, throwing the envelope on the ground where photographs scattered across the pavement. 2 years of pictures. Dianne at the grocery store, Dianne at the library, Dianne walking to her prenatal appointments. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Dianne stared at the photographs with growing horror. They showed her daily routine in intimate detail, leaving her apartment, walking to work, sitting in the library's break room. Some were taken with a telephoto lens from considerable distance. Others were close enough that the photographer would have been within yards of her. "You've been watching me," she whispered. "For how long?" 6 months, Marcus said proudly. I found you 6 months ago, but I wanted to understand your new life before I approached you. I wanted to see if you'd learned to be a better wife, if you'd grown out of your teenage rebellion phase. You've been stalking me for 6 months? Detective Morrison's voice carried new urgency. This wasn't a domestic dispute anymore. This was criminal behavior that had been ongoing for months. I was monitoring my wife's well-being, Marcus corrected, making sure she was taking care of herself during her pregnancy, making sure she wasn't putting my child at risk with her reckless behavior. Officer Bradley was now speaking quietly into his radio, calling for additional units. The situation was escalating beyond what 3 officers could safely handle. Marcus, Dianne said, her hand moving protectively to her belly where the baby had begun kicking frantically, responding to her elevated heart rate. This baby might not even be yours. The words were out before she could stop them, and the effect was immediate. Marcus's face went completely white, then flushed with a rage so intense that even Detective Morrison took an involuntary step backward. What did you say? I said this. Baby might not be yours. The timing. You're lying. His voice was deadly quiet now, more frightening than his shouting had been. You're lying because you're desperate and cornered, and you think you can hurt me with lies. I'm not lying. After I left you, I met someone else. The dates could work either way. Marcus stood perfectly still for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold calculation that made Diane's skin crawl. Then it doesn't matter whose baby it is, he said, because if it's not mine, you stole 2 years of my life chasing someone else's bastard. And if it is mine, you kept my child from me for 2 years. Either way, you owe me a debt that can only be paid one way. Mr. Watson, Detective Morrison said urgently, you need to step back and calm down. Making threats is not going to help your situation. I'm not making threats, Detective. I'm explaining consequences. Dianne has never understood consequences. She thinks she can do whatever she wants and just run away when things get difficult. The sound of additional sirens was growing closer, but Dianne could see in Marcus's expression that he was running out of patience with the situation. He'd come here with a plan, and that plan wasn't working out the way he'd expected. You know what the funny thing is, Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that Dianne recognized as extremely dangerous. I actually hoped we could work this out. I hoped that motherhood might have taught you some responsibility, some gratitude for what you had. Marcus, please, but you're still the same selfish little girl who thinks the world owes her something, still convinced that you're the victim in this story. He shook his head sadly. I should have learned from your mother. The mention of her mother hit Dianne like a physical blow. Her mother had died when Dianne was 12, and Marcus had rarely mentioned her during their marriage. What does my mother have to do with this? Marcus smiled, and it was the most chilling expression she'd ever seen on his face. Your mother didn't run away, Dianne. She knew better than that. She understood that some obligations can't be escaped. My mother died of cancer. Your mother died because she tried to leave your father, and he made sure she understood that leaving wasn't an option. Cancer was just the story they told everyone else. The implication hit her like a sledgehammer. Whether it was true or just another one of Marcus's psychological weapons, the message was clear. Running away only delayed the inevitable. You're lying, she whispered. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but you'll never know for sure, will you? Just like you'll never know if you're really safe, no matter how far you run or how well you hide. Detective Morrison was speaking urgently into his radio now, but Marcus seemed to have decided that conversation time was over. He reached into his jacket again, and this time what he pulled out definitely wasn't photographs. The knife Marcus pulled from his jacket wasn't large, just a folding blade maybe 4 inches long, but in the afternoon sunlight it seemed to draw all the light from the parking lot. Dianne had seen it before, years ago, when Marcus used it to cut rope for a camping trip, back when she still believed their marriage might be salvageable. "Drop the weapon!" Detective Morrison shouted, his service pistol now drawn and trained on Marcus. Officer Bradley had his weapon out as well, while Noel moved protectively in front of Dianne, but Marcus didn't seem to hear them. His attention was focused entirely on Dianne, and his expression held the same terrible patience she remembered from their worst fights. The look that said he had all the time in the world to make his point. 2 years, he said conversationally, as if 3 armed police officers weren't pointing guns at him. 2 years of wondering if you were alive or dead, if you'd found someone else, if my child was growing up calling another man daddy. Marcus, put the knife down, Dianne pleaded. Please think about what you're doing. I am thinking. I've had 2 years to think about nothing else. He took a step closer, and immediately 3 voices shouted warnings at him. Do you know what kept me going during those 2 years? The fantasy that when I found you, you'd be sorry, that you'd realize what a mistake you'd made and beg me to take you back. The baby was kicking frantically now, responding to Dianne's terror and elevated heart rate. She could feel contractions beginning, not labor yet, but stress-induced cramping, that reminded her how vulnerable she was in her current state. Sir, last warning, Detective Morrison called out. Drop the weapon and step back. Marcus ignored him completely. But you're not sorry, are you, Dianne? You're still convinced that you're the victim here, still believe that running away was the right choice. It was the right choice, she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. You hurt me, Marcus. For years you hurt me. I disciplined you. There's a difference. The casual way he said it, as if hitting his wife was simply household management, made even Detective Morrison flinch. This wasn't a man who had lost control. This was someone who genuinely believed he had the right to use violence to maintain authority. Marcus, Noel said carefully, I can see you're in pain, but this isn't going to fix anything. Put the knife down and let's talk. For the first time, Marcus seemed to notice the sergeant. You must be the knight in shining armor who's been protecting my wife. Tell me, officer, what exactly do you think you know about our situation? I know that threatening a pregnant woman is wrong, regardless of your relationship history. Marcus laughed. Threatening? I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply having a conversation with my wife about the consequences of her choices. That's when Dianne felt it. A sudden, warm wetness between her legs. At first, she thought it was urine, a common occurrence in late pregnancy. But as the sensation continued, spreading down her thighs, she realized what was happening. My water just broke, she said quietly. The words seemed to freeze everyone in place. Marcus's expression shifted from rage to confusion, while the police officers exchanged uncertain glances. This was no longer just a domestic dispute with a weapon. This was a medical emergency. We need to get her to a hospital, Noel said urgently. Nobody's going anywhere, Marcus snapped, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The reality of impending childbirth was something he hadn't planned for. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Dianne doubled over with pain. When she straightened up, she saw something in Marcus's eyes that she'd never seen before. Genuine. Fear. The baby's coming, she gasped. Marcus, I need medical attention, please. This could be another one of your manipulations, he said, but his voice wavered. You've faked medical emergencies before. When have I ever faked a medical emergency? The time you claimed to have chest pains to get out of going to my company Christmas party. The time you said you had food poisoning when my mother came to visit. Even in her pain, Dianne was amazed by his ability to rewrite history. Those hadn't been fake emergencies. They'd been desperate attempts to avoid situations where his public facade would require her to pretend everything was normal while hiding fresh bruises. Sir, Detective Morrison said, regardless of your marital issues, we have a woman in labor. We need to get medical personnel here immediately. No, Marcus said firmly. This is between me and my wife. I've been denied the chance to be part of this pregnancy for 2 years. I'm not missing the birth of my child. Marcus, Dianne said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. "This baby might not be yours. I told you. You're lying." "I'm not lying. After I left you, I was in a shelter in Kentucky. There was a man there helping his sister move to a safe house. We spent one night together before I came here." The confession hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Marcus stared at her with an expression of such rage and betrayal that for a moment she thought he might actually use the knife. "One night," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite her physical pain. "One night with someone who was kind to me, who didn't hurt me, who treated me like a human being instead of property. You cheated on me. I left you, Marcus. You can't cheat on someone you've divorced. We're still married in the eyes of God." The religious justification was new, but Dianne recognized it as another tool of control. Marcus had never been particularly religious during their marriage, but apparently he'd found faith when it suited his narrative. Detective Morrison was speaking into his radio again. "We need paramedics at 247 Maple Street immediately. Pregnant woman in labor, armed subject on scene." "The timing works both ways," Dianne continued, needing Marcus to understand the full implications. "Based on the conception date, either man could be the father. I won't know for sure until after the baby's born and we can do DNA testing." Marcus stood perfectly still, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and deadly. "Then it doesn't matter." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if this baby isn't mine, you've cost me 2 years of my life chasing a lie. And if it is mine, you've kept my child from me for 2 years and allowed another man to believe he might be the father." His grip tightened on the knife. "Either way, you've betrayed me in the worst possible way." Another contraction hit, this one so strong that Dianne cried out and had to grab Noel's arm for support. Through the pain, she saw Marcus's expression change again. The confusion and hurt were being replaced by something much more dangerous, cold calculation. "You know what the beautiful thing is about this situation?" Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost philosophical tone. "If the baby's mine, I have every right to be here for its birth. And if it's not mine, then you've just confessed to adultery and fraud." "Marcus, please," Dianne started, but he cut her off. "Either way, you owe me a debt. Either way, this ends today." The sound of sirens was getting closer, paramedics responding to the medical emergency, but Dianne could see in Marcus's eyes that he was running out of patience with the situation. He'd come here with a plan, and while the details were falling apart, his ultimate goal remained the same. "Sir," Noel said carefully, "the paramedics will be here in less than 2 minutes. Let them help her, and then we can sort out everything else." "Everything else?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Officer, there is nothing else. This woman destroyed my life, and now she's trying to destroy it again with lies about the paternity of what might be my child. Even if the baby isn't yours, threatening a woman in labor is what, justice? Because that's what this is. Justice for 2 years of lies and manipulation and theft." Dianne felt another contraction building and realized with growing terror that this baby was coming whether Marcus was ready or not. The contractions were getting closer together, stronger, and she could feel the pressure increasing with each wave of pain. "Marcus," she gasped, "I need to sit down. I need help." But Marcus seemed to be operating in his own reality now, one where his pain and betrayal justified anything he might do. "You should have thought about needing help before you disappeared with my child." "Sir," Detective Morrison said, his voice carrying new authority, "I'm ordering you to drop that weapon and step away. We have paramedics arriving, and they need access to the victim." "Victim?" Marcus's voice rose with indignation. "I'm the victim. Here. I'm the one whose wife vanished in the middle of the night. I'm the one who spent 2 years wondering if my child was alive or dead." The paramedic sirens were very close now, and Marcus seemed to realize that his window of opportunity was closing. Whatever he'd planned to accomplish here, whatever closure or justice or revenge he'd been seeking, it had to happen soon, or not at all. "You want to know the real truth?" he said, his voice taking on the cold clarity that Dianne remembered from his worst moments. "The truth is that you've never understood consequences. You've always believed that you could do whatever you wanted and just run away when things got complicated. Marcus. But some things can't be run away from, Dianne. Some debts have to be paid." That's when Detective Morrison made his decision. As Marcus raised the knife, shifting his weight forward in preparation for movement toward Dianne, the detective's training took over. "Drop it now." But Marcus was no longer listening to commands from anyone. In his mind, this had stopped being a police matter and become something much more personal, something that had to be settled between a husband and wife, regardless of what the law or society might have to say about it. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing the danger, and Dianne realized that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine not just her future, but her child's as well. And for the first time in 16 years, she decided to fight back. The paramedics arrived as Marcus took his first step toward Dianne, their ambulance screeching into the parking lot with lights flashing. The sound seemed to snap something in Marcus's mind. Suddenly there were too many people, too many witnesses, too many complications to his plan. "Everyone stay back," he shouted, waving the knife in an arc that encompassed the police officers, the arriving paramedics, and the growing crowd of neighbors who had emerged from their homes. "This is between me and my wife." "Sir, we're here to help," called one of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "We need to get to the patient." "She's not your patient, she's my wife." Marcus's voice was becoming increasingly shrill. "I've been taking care of her for 16 years, and I don't need help from strangers." Another contraction hit Dianne, this one so intense that she couldn't suppress a cry of pain. The sound seemed to affect Marcus in a way that all the police commands hadn't. For a moment, his expression softened with something that might have been genuine concern. "Is the baby coming?" he asked. And for just an instant, his voice held an echo of the man she'd once loved. "Yes," Dianne gasped. "Marcus, please, whatever you think I've done to you, this baby is innocent. Let them help." "If it's my baby, even if it's not your baby. Please." The plea hung in the air between them, and Dianne could see Marcus wrestling with emotions that were too complex for his simple narrative of betrayal and revenge. This was the moment she'd learned to recognize during their marriage, the split second when he might choose mercy over violence, when the man he'd once been might resurface long enough to prevent disaster. But then Detective Morrison made a tactical error. Seeing Marcus's momentary hesitation, he took a step closer, trying to close the distance while the suspect was distracted. Marcus whirled toward him, the knife slashing through the air in a warning arc. "I told you to stay back." "Easy, easy," Detective Morrison said, raising his hands but not retreating. "Nobody wants anyone to get hurt here." "Then you should have listened when I told you this was a private matter." Sergeant Noel, meanwhile, had been quietly positioning himself. Unlike the detective, he wasn't trying to get closer to Marcus. Instead, he was creating an angle that would allow him to shield Dianne if Marcus decided to lunge. It was a move, born of experience, of understanding that sometimes the best way to de-escalate was to be ready for escalation. "Mr. Watson," Noel said carefully, "I can see you're in pain. I can see you feel like you've been wronged, but hurting Dianne won't fix what's broken here. What's broken is that my wife thinks she can just disappear and start a new life like our marriage never happened." "Your marriage is over, Marcus," Dianne said, finding strength in her voice despite the pain. "It's been over for 2 years. Whatever this baby's paternity, that doesn't change the fact that we're divorced. We're divorced on paper, but marriage is more than paper, Dianne. Marriage is a sacred bond that doesn't just disappear because you file some documents." The religious language was becoming more prominent in his speech, and Dianne recognized it as another tool of control. During their marriage, Marcus had used selective biblical passages to justify his behavior: submission of wives, forgiveness of husbands, the sanctity of marriage above all other considerations. Marriage is also supposed to be about love and respect, she replied, about partnership, not ownership. I did love you. The words exploded from him with such force that everyone in the parking lot took an involuntary step back. I loved you more than any woman deserved to be loved. I provided for you. I protected you. I gave you everything a wife could want. You hit me, Marcus. You terrorized me. You caused 3 miscarriages through violence. I never... He stopped, his face cycling through emotions: denial, anger, something that might have been shame. You were difficult sometimes. You needed guidance. That's what husbands do. They guide their wives. Guidance doesn't leave bruises. You're exaggerating. You always exaggerated everything. But even as he said it, Dianne could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Some part of him, maybe a part he'd buried very deep, remembered the truth of what their marriage had been. The paramedic was speaking quietly into her radio, probably requesting police backup and updating the hospital about a complicated delivery situation. The other paramedic, a young man with kind eyes, was slowly approaching with a medical bag. "Ma'am," he called to Dianne, "how far apart are your contractions?" "About 3 minutes," she managed to say between breaths. "Okay, we need to get you to the hospital soon. This baby's not going to wait much longer." Marcus's head snapped toward the paramedic. "She's not going anywhere." "Sir, she's in active labor. If there are complications, there won't be complications. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without needing hospitals." The casual dismissal of modern medical care, the assumption that he could control even the basic biology of childbirth, crystallized everything that had been wrong with their marriage. Marcus had always believed that his will was sufficient to bend reality to his preferences. "Marcus," Dianne said, her voice growing stronger despite her physical distress, "you can't control this. You can't control me anymore. And you can't control whether this baby is yours or not. I can control what happens next." The threat was clear, and Sergeant Noel tensed, his hand moving imperceptibly closer to his weapon. He'd been in this situation before, not exactly this situation, but close. Enough. A man with nothing left to lose, a woman he couldn't save, and the terrible moment when words stopped working. "Sarah Chen called us 17 times, he said quietly, almost to himself. "What?" Marcus turned toward him, momentarily confused by the non sequitur. "Sarah Chen. Another woman in another town, with another man who thought he owned her. She called us 17 times before he killed her." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Noel's voice was steady, professional, but underneath it was something that sounded like controlled fury. "I think you know that this isn't about love or marriage or family. This is about control. This is about a man who can't accept that a woman has the right to choose her own life. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know that scared women don't hide in closets calling 911 unless they have good reason to be scared." Marcus's grip on the knife tightened, and Dianne saw his knuckles go white with pressure. The conversation had reached the point where words were becoming inadequate for the emotions involved. "Sarah Chen's daughter still has nightmares," Noel continued relentlessly. "She's 6 years old now, and she still wakes up screaming because she saw what her father did to her mother." "Shut up. Is that what you want for this baby? To grow up knowing that their father killed their mother?" "Shut up." But Noel wasn't finished. Years of guilt and regret and determination not to fail again were driving him forward. "Because that's what this is, Mr. Watson. You're not trying to save your marriage. You're not trying to reunite your family. You're trying to make sure that if you can't have her, nobody can." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Dianne could see Marcus struggling with the truth of it, because that was exactly what this was: not love, but possession; not family reunification, but ultimate control. Another contraction. Hit, stronger than any before, and Dianne doubled over with a scream that she couldn't suppress. When she looked up, she saw something in Marcus's eyes that terrified her more than his anger ever had. He'd made his decision, and it wasn't the decision of a man who planned to let anyone walk away from this parking lot. Marcus moved toward Dianne with the knife raised, his face a mask of cold determination. In that instant, 16 years of fear and conditioning told Dianne to freeze, to submit, to hope that compliance might somehow minimize the damage. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She grabbed the nearest object, a metal trash can lid that had been blown against the building, and swung it at Marcus with all the strength her pregnant body could muster. The improvised shield caught him across the forearm, and the knife went flying across the pavement as he stumbled backward in shock. For a moment, he stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed. "You hit me," he said, his voice filled with wounded disbelief. "Yes," Dianne said, still clutching the trash can lid like a shield. "I hit you." It was such a simple statement, but it carried the weight of 16 years of accumulated rage and fear and suppressed self-defense. Marcus had built his control on her passivity, on her learned helplessness, on her belief that resistance would only make things worse. But she wasn't the same terrified 22-year-old who had accepted his first backhand as somehow deserved. She was a woman who had survived, who had escaped, who had built a new life from nothing, and she was about to become a mother. "You can't hit me," Marcus said, as if stating a fundamental law of nature. "Wives don't hit their husbands. Ex-wives do," she replied, breathing hard as another contraction built. "Ex-wives definitely do." Sergeant Noel used Marcus's momentary confusion to move closer, his weapon drawn but not yet aimed. The knife was on the ground 6 feet away from Marcus, but everyone knew that distances could be closed quickly by a desperate man. "Mr. Watson," Noel said firmly, "it's over. Step away from the weapon and put your hands behind your head." But Marcus wasn't processing commands anymore. His entire worldview had just been shattered by a pregnant woman with a garbage can lid, and he was struggling to recalibrate reality to fit this new information. "Dianne," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that she'd never heard before, "you don't understand what you're doing. You're destroying our family." "We don't have a family, Marcus. We haven't had a family for years. What we had was a prison with 2 inmates, and I escaped." The paramedics had taken advantage of the distraction to move closer, and the female paramedic was now crouched beside Dianne, checking her pulse and asking quiet questions about her contractions. "How far apart?" the paramedic asked. "Less than 2 minutes now," Dianne gasped, "and they're getting stronger." "Okay. We need to move you now. Can you walk to the ambulance?" Marcus heard this exchange and suddenly seemed to remember why he was there. "She's not going to any hospital. This baby is going to be born here, where I can make sure it's really mine." "Sir," Detective Morrison said, his weapon now drawn and trained on Marcus, "you need to step away. The woman needs medical attention. The woman is my wife. The woman is in labor." Marcus looked around the parking lot, seeming to take in for the first time the number of people arrayed against him. 3 police officers with weapons drawn, 2 paramedics with radios, a growing crowd of neighbors with cell phones, and his ex-wife wielding a trash can lid like a warrior's shield. Whatever scenario he'd imagined when he'd tracked Dianne down, this chaos hadn't been part of it. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he said, and for the first time he sounded lost rather than angry. "How was it supposed to go, Marcus?" Dianne asked, genuinely curious despite her pain and fear. "You were supposed to be sorry. You were supposed to realize that leaving was a mistake and ask me to forgive you." His voice broke slightly. "You were supposed to come home." The admission hung in the air, pathetic and heartbreaking despite everything he'd done. For just a moment, Dianne could see the man she'd once loved. Confused, hurt, unable to understand why his version of love hadn't been enough. "I can never come home, Marcus," she said gently, "because home was never safe for me. I kept you safe. I protected you from everything. You were the thing I needed protection from." Another contraction hit, this one so intense that Dianne dropped the trash can lid and had to grab the paramedic's arm for support. When the pain passed, she looked up to see Marcus staring at her with an expression of such anguish that it almost looked like grief. "The baby's coming," the paramedic said urgently. "We need to move her now." "Nobody moves," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked toward the knife on the ground, then at the officers with their weapons trained on him, then back at Dianne as she struggled with another contraction. "Marcus," she said, her voice strained but determined, "if you ever loved me at all, you'll let them help me. You'll let this baby be born safely. If it's my baby, if it's your baby, then you'll want it to be healthy. If it's not your baby, then you have no reason to keep me here." The logic was simple, irrefutable, and Marcus seemed to realize that his position had become untenable. He couldn't claim to love her while preventing her from receiving medical care. He couldn't claim to want the best for the baby while keeping her from the hospital. "I just wanted my family back," he said quietly. This was never the way to get it. Sergeant Noel saw an opening and took it, moving quickly to kick the knife further away from Marcus while keeping his weapon trained on him. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your head and get on your knees." For a moment, it looked like Marcus might comply. His shoulders sagged with defeat, and he glanced once more at Dianne, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Then his expression hardened again, and Dianne realized that surrender had never really been an option for him. "If I can't have my family," he said quietly, "then nobody can." Marcus lunged toward the knife on the ground, but Sergeant Noel was already moving. Years of training and the memory of Sarah Chen's death had prepared him for this moment, and he reacted with the split-second timing that separated good cops from dead ones. The tackle caught Marcus in the midsection just as his fingers brushed the knife handle, sending both men tumbling across the asphalt. They hit the ground hard, with Noel using his weight and leverage to pin Marcus face down while reaching for his handcuffs. "Stay down!" Noel shouted, pressing his knee into Marcus's back. "Don't move!" But Marcus was beyond rational thought now. Driven by the desperate fury of a man who had lost control of everything he'd tried to possess, he bucked and twisted, trying to throw off the sergeant's weight, his face scraped and bleeding from the impact with the pavement. "Get off me!" Marcus screamed. "She's my wife. That's my baby." "Sir, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, stalking, and threatening a police officer," Detective Morrison announced, moving in to assist with the handcuffs. Meanwhile, the paramedics had surrounded Dianne, who was now having contractions less than a minute apart. The female paramedic, whose name tag read J. Martinez, was speaking into her radio with urgent professionalism. "We have a woman in active labor, approximately 38 weeks, contractions every 45 seconds. We need a delivery kit and immediate transport to County General. Can you make it to the hospital?" her partner asked. "I don't think so," Martinez replied, feeling Dianne's abdomen during a contraction. "This baby's coming now." As if to confirm her assessment, Dianne felt an overwhelming urge to push that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Her body was taking over, following instincts that were older than civilization, and there was no stopping what was happening. "I need to push," she gasped. "Okay, honey, we're going to do this right here," Martinez said calmly. "My partner's getting the delivery kit from the ambulance. You're going to be fine." Through the chaos of her labor, Dianne could hear Marcus still struggling with the officers, his voice growing increasingly desperate and incoherent. The man who had terrorized her for 16 years was finally being held accountable. But all she could focus on was the life that was fighting to be born. "On the next contraction, I want you to push," Martinez instructed. "But only when I tell you." Dianne nodded, concentrating on breathing and trying to process the surreal nature of giving birth in a parking lot while her abusive ex-husband was being arrested 6 feet away. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment during her quiet prenatal. Classes at the library, the contraction built like a wave, and when Martinez gave the signal, Dianne pushed with every ounce of strength she had left. The pressure was intense, overwhelming, but also strangely empowering. After years of feeling helpless, her body was doing something that no one else could control. "Good, good," Martinez encouraged. "I can see the head. One more push like that and we'll have your baby." Marcus had stopped struggling and was now sobbing into the asphalt, his face pressed against the ground as Noel secured the handcuffs. "Please," he was saying over and over, "please, I just want to see my baby born." "That's not your decision to make anymore," Noel replied firmly. Dianne felt the next contraction building and knew this was it. 16 years of fear and pain and accumulated trauma were about to end with the birth of something completely new, a life that would never know the terror she'd lived with for so long. "Push!" Martinez commanded. Dianne pushed, and suddenly there was relief, release, and then the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. A baby's first cry, strong and healthy and indignant at being forced out of its warm, safe home. "It's a girl," Martinez announced, lifting the baby for Dianne to see. A perfect, beautiful girl. Through her tears, Dianne saw her daughter for the first time, wrinkled and red and absolutely perfect, with a full head of dark hair and tiny fists that waved, in protest at the bright world she'd just entered. "Hi, baby," Dianne whispered, reaching out to touch the impossibly small fingers. "Hi, Emma." The name came out without conscious thought. Emma, which meant strength or universal. It seemed appropriate for a child who had survived domestic violence, a difficult pregnancy and birth during a police standoff. Marcus had stopped sobbing and was now straining to lift his head, trying to see the baby despite his restrained position. "Is it really a girl?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Dianne said, cradling Emma against her chest, as Martinez worked to clean and examine the baby. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, and for the first time in hours, his voice held no anger or calculation, just wonder and something that might have been love. "Yes, she is." For a moment the parking lot was quiet, except for Emma's healthy cries and the distant sound of more sirens approaching. Detective Morrison was on his radio, probably calling for additional units and updating the situation. Sergeant Noel was still kneeling beside Marcus, but his attention kept drifting to Dianne and the baby. "We need to get you both to the hospital," Martinez said. "Everything looks good, but you need to be examined, and the baby needs her full newborn workup." As they prepared to move Dianne to the ambulance, she looked down at Marcus one more time. He was staring at Emma with an expression of such longing that it almost broke her heart. "Marcus," she said quietly. "Yeah? Whatever happens with the DNA test, whatever the results say about paternity, this ends here. No more tracking, no more threats, no more trying to control my life." He was quiet for a long moment. "And if she's mine, if she's yours, we'll figure out visitation through the courts, supervised with conditions, but she'll know her father." Dianne paused, choosing her words carefully. "But if you ever threaten me or her again, if you ever come near us without permission, I'll make sure you never see either of us again. And if she's not mine, then you need to let us go. Completely. Forever." Marcus closed his eyes, and when I did, he opened them again. Some of the fight had gone out of him. "I think I already know the answer." "What do you mean?" "She doesn't look like me, Dianne. She doesn't look like me at all." It was true. Emma had Dianne's delicate features, but her eyes and the shape of her face seemed to echo someone else entirely. Someone gentle and kind who had offered comfort during the darkest period of Dianne's life. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and for the first time he sounded like he meant it. "I know," Dianne replied. "I'm sorry too." As the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, Dianne looked back one more time at the parking lot where her old life had finally ended and her new one had literally been born. Sergeant Noel was watching from beside his patrol car, and she caught his eye as the ambulance doors began to close. "Thank you," she mouthed. He nodded once, a gesture that said everything that needed to be said between two people who had faced the worst of humanity and chosen to fight for something better. Then the doors closed, and Dianne was alone with her daughter, finally and truly free. 3 months later, Dianne Watson sat in a courthouse waiting room, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, while they waited to be called for Marcus's sentencing hearing. The DNA test results had confirmed what everyone already suspected. Emma's father was David Chen, the gentleman who had helped her move to the shelter in Kentucky. David had flown in from Seattle the week before, meeting his daughter for the first time with tears in his eyes and a promise to be part of her life in whatever way Dianne felt comfortable with. The courthouse was a far cry from the chaotic parking lot where Emma had been born. Here, everything was ordered, official, designed to dispense justice according to law rather than emotion. Dianne had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with a victim's advocate to write an impact statement that captured 16 years of abuse without drowning in bitterness. "Ms. Watson," a young prosecutor approached, her expression professionally sympathetic. "We're ready for you." Dianne stood carefully, adjusting Emma in her arms. At 3 months old, her daughter was alert and curious, with David's gentle eyes and her own stubborn chin. She'd grown from a tiny preemie into a healthy, happy baby who smiled at everyone and seemed to find joy in the simplest things. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with perhaps 30 people scattered across the wooden benches. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his hair longer than she remembered, and his face gaunt from months in county jail. When he saw her enter with Emma, his expression shifted through surprise, longing, and finally a kind of resignation. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the defendant has pled guilty to stalking, assault with a deadly weapon, making threats against a police officer, and violation of a restraining order. We're asking for the maximum sentence of 8 years. In state prison, the judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked down at her paperwork before addressing the court. "I've read the victim impact statement, and I've reviewed the defendant's history. This appears to be a case of escalating domestic violence that culminated in a very dangerous situation." She turned to Dianne. "Ms. Watson, would you like to address the court?" Dianne had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but standing here with Emma in her arms, looking at the man who had controlled her life for so long, the prepared words seemed inadequate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 16 years ago, I was a 19-year-old girl with no family and no support system. Marcus seemed like salvation. Older, confident, successful. I thought I was lucky that someone like him wanted someone like me." Marcus was staring at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't recognize the signs of control because I had nothing to compare it to. When he started making all our decisions, I thought it meant he cared. When he isolated me from friends, I thought it meant he wanted to protect me. When he started hitting me, I thought it meant I was failing as a wife." Emma stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up. Dianne adjusted her daughter's position, drawing strength from the warm weight of new life. "It took me years to understand that love doesn't hurt, love doesn't terrorize, love doesn't destroy the person it claims to cherish." She looked directly at Marcus for the first time. What Marcus called love was actually possession. What he called protection was actually control. Marcus's face crumpled, and she could see tears on his cheeks. "But I'm not here to ask for revenge," Dianne continued. "I'm here to ask for justice, and for the protection that will allow my daughter to grow up safe from the cycle of violence that defined my marriage." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Watson, do you wish to address the court?" before sentencing. Marcus stood slowly, his handcuffs clinking softly. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Your Honor, I want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused Dianne, and I'm sorry for the fear I put her through." He looked toward Dianne and Emma. "I told myself for years that I was protecting her, that I was being a good husband, but sitting in jail for 3 months, I've had time to really think about what I did." He paused, struggling with words. "I think I knew it was wrong, even while I was doing it. I think I knew that hitting her wasn't discipline, that controlling her wasn't love, that tracking her down wasn't romantic. But admitting that would have meant admitting that I was the monster in our story, not the hero." The courtroom was completely quiet except for the soft sounds Emma was making as she began to wake up fully. "I can't undo what I did," Marcus continued. "I can't give Dianne back the years I stole or the babies I—" His voice broke. "I can't fix what I broke, but I can promise that I will never bother her or her daughter again. I can promise that when I get out of prison, I will stay as far away from them as possible." He sat down heavily, and the judge took a moment to consider her words. "Mr. Watson, the court appreciates your apparent remorse, but remorse doesn't undo 16 years of systematic abuse. It doesn't erase the terror you inflicted on Ms. Watson, and it doesn't minimize the danger you posed to her and her unborn child." She looked at her paperwork again. "Domestic violence is one of the most serious crimes this court sees, not just because of the immediate harm it causes, but because of the long-term damage it does to victims and their families. You didn't just hurt Ms. Watson physically, you damaged her ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe she deserved better treatment." Emma had awakened fully now and was looking around the courtroom with curious eyes. Several people, including the judge, seemed drawn to her bright expression and obvious health. "However," the judge continued, "the court also notes that Ms. Watson has not only survived, but thrived. She successfully escaped an abusive situation, built a new life under difficult circumstances, and is now raising a healthy child. Her strength and resilience are remarkable." She turned back to Marcus. "The court sentences you to 6 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years, contingent on completion of domestic violence counseling and anger management programs. You are also ordered to pay restitution for Ms. Watson's medical expenses and to have no contact with her or her family unless specifically authorized by a court." Marcus nodded, accepting the sentence without protest. "Furthermore," the judge added, "should you violate the no-contact order in any way, you will serve the full 8 years with no possibility of early release." As the bailiff led Marcus away, he looked back one more time at Dianne and Emma. There was sadness in his expression, but also something that might have been acceptance. Perhaps prison would give him the time and space he needed to truly understand what he'd done. Perhaps not. But either way, it was no longer Dianne's responsibility to fix him. Outside the courthouse, Sergeant Noel was waiting by his patrol car. He'd been promoted to detective after his handling of the Marcus Watson case, and he'd testified during the trial about the pattern of escalating behavior he'd observed. "How did it go?" he asked, as Dianne approached with Emma. 6 years. Possibility of parole after 4. That's a good sentence for the charges he pled to. Dianne nodded, adjusting Emma's blanket against the cool afternoon air. "Detective Noel, I wanted to thank you again. If you hadn't believed me that day, you don't need to thank me for doing my job. It was more than your job. You saw something that other officers might have missed." Noel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the traffic passing by the courthouse. "I told you about Sarah Chen, about how I failed her by following protocol, instead of trusting my instincts. This was different. This was a second chance. Not everyone gets one of those." Emma made a small sound and reached out toward Noel, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. He smiled and gently touched her hand, marveling at how small and perfect her fingers were. "She's beautiful," he said. "She's everything good that came out of something terrible." That's usually how it works. The best things often grow in the places where the worst things happened. As Dianne walked to her car, Emma, sleeping again in her arms, she reflected on how much had changed in just 3 months. She'd moved to a larger apartment with better security, started working as a victim's advocate at the women's shelter, and begun building relationships with people who knew her true story and supported her journey. David had proven to be everything Marcus wasn't: patient, respectful, willing to let their relationship develop naturally without pressure or demands. He visited every few weeks, slowly building a bond with Emma, while carefully respecting the boundaries Dianne needed to maintain her sense of safety. Most importantly, she'd reclaimed her real name. No more Diana Miller. She was Dianne Watson again. But this time the name carried strength instead of shame. She'd learned that hiding from the past wasn't the same as healing from it, and that true freedom came not from running away, but from standing up. The trauma would always be part of her story. There would probably always be moments when unexpected sounds or movements would trigger memories of fear. But trauma was no longer the defining element of her life. Now it was simply one chapter in a longer story. A story that included escape, survival, motherhood, and the kind of love that healed instead of harmed. As she buckled Emma into her car seat, Dianne thought about the young women she counseled at the shelter, frightened, desperate, convinced that their situations were hopeless. She understood their fear because she'd lived it, but she also understood something they didn't yet know: that strength often grew in the wreckage, that survival was possible, and that sometimes the most broken places became the foundation for something beautiful. Emma opened her eyes as they drove through downtown Millbrook, taking in the familiar streets of the town that had become their sanctuary. This was home now, not because it was where they were hiding, but because it was where they chose to be. In a few years, when Emma was old enough to ask questions, Dianne would tell her the truth about where she came from and why. She would explain that sometimes people made bad choices, that sometimes love got confused with control, but that none of that had anything to do with Emma's worth or future possibilities. She would tell her daughter that every person had the right to safety, respect, and the freedom to choose their own path. She would teach her to recognize the difference between love and possession, between protection and control, between partnership and domination. Most of all, she would teach Emma that no matter what happened in life, no matter what challenges arose, she always had choices. She didn't have to accept mistreatment, she didn't have to settle for less than she deserved, and she never had to stay anywhere that made her feel small or afraid. The parking lot where Emma had been born was just ahead, and Dianne slowed down as they passed it. The space looked peaceful now, just another ordinary place where ordinary people lived their lives. There was no sign of the chaos that had erupted there 3 months ago, no indication that it had been the setting for the end of one story and the beginning of another. But Dianne would always remember it as the place where she'd finally learned to fight back, where she'd discovered that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about claiming the right to thrive. It was where she'd become not just a victim who escaped, but a woman who chose her own future. As they turned toward home, Emma made the soft cooing sounds that meant she was content, safe, loved. And for the first time in 16 years, Dianne felt the same way.